So you guys have been traveling around the world with the film this week. Thanks for coming back here to talk about it with us. I want to begin with the story. And when the big turns in this film came to you, I know you set up some mysteries at the beginning of this trilogy with The Force Awakens. Did you have a sense what that ship meant when she saw it in the vision, back when you first worked on the film, and where you were going to go with the nature of your history and your destiny?
Wow. First of all, thank you all for being here. I cannot tell you what a thrill it is. Thank you. Thank you all. It's a good question. When we were working on Force Awakens, Larry Kasdan and I had a lot of conversations about obviously where it would go, what would happen in 8 and 9. There were all sorts of things we wanted to do in 7 that there was just no way to get in, including having Lando come in, including training with Luke, all these things that we just knew we ultimately couldn't fit in. And as we were working on getting 7 up and running, Kathy brought on Ryan to work on 8. And he obviously read what we were doing, and he was working on his story. And literally the focus was, let's get Force Awakens up on its feet and actually filmed. So we were scrambling to do that. And all of these conversations that we had had suddenly became things that Ryan was taking and running with. And of course, we read drafts and had conversations about that. But I was never supposed to work on this one. So while we knew her parents were on that ship, and we had conversations about who she was and all sorts of things, and they were sort of shapes in the fog of where we were going, that was years and films away, and there were things that we were excited and ready to talk about. But when Ryan came on, it was suddenly his story to continue. And when Kathy called me and said, would you come to work on this film, suddenly it was now. And there was an incredibly loud ticking clock. And in fact, 1.5 years had gone by, which we were starting over. So it was a lot of work to do in with the release date not moving. And those questions suddenly, Chris and I picked up those exact conversations and continued them and answered them as we did.
Chris, when did the name Palpatine first come up in your discussions?
Well, pretty early on. I mean, JJ and I always talked about this as the Skywalker saga, a family saga. Palpatine in the prequels is the person who corrupts Anakin Skywalker. The beginning of the whole story is when Palpatine takes Anakin aside and tries to convince him that he can give immortality to the person he loves, Padme, played by Natalie Portman. And so the Skywalker Palpatine sort of family dynasty tragedy, like any kind of Greek tragedy between two great houses, was deep in the DNA of Star Wars. And so we knew that Palpatine had to be a presence in this film in some way. And as it turned out, there was this gift that George Lucas wrote that was sitting there, because there's a scene in one of the prequels in which Palpatine says to Hayden Christensen, Anakin Skywalker, which is directly quoted in the film, the dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. And it was hanging there as this tease of non-natural abilities that the Sith had to prolong life even after death. And so JJ and I thought we'd be crazy not to pick up that thread and tie all the trilogies together. Because there's a Jedi way of life, which is self-sacrifice and giving your life for others and letting your spirit join the Force like those who've gone before you. And then there's the Sith way of looking at life, which is unnaturally clinging to the material life for self-interest.
I moderated the Q&A here when The Last Jedi came out, and Ryan, I asked him about the nature of her origin and all that, and he said, well, Chris and JJ are writing that now, so there's always a question of a certain point of view, which is of course, the Obi-Wan Kenobi line. And he said they're going to pick up the baton and run with it, but he wanted to give an answer to her that would be the most devastating she could receive. And the idea that she had no connection to anybody was his answer to that. I feel that you as you do with the next film, you have to up the ante, and in this film she finds out not only is she nobody, but she's descended from somebody terrible. Why is that important thematically? What do you think that provides to the story and the way it connects emotionally?
Well, I think that one of the ideas, one of the themes of the movie is that anyone can be anything, regardless of where you're from. And I don't know if it resonates for everyone, but I think there are quite a few people who appreciate that idea of not coming from a place that you're particularly excited about following or proud of, and though I completely understand your nobody is a devastating thing, to me the more painful, the more shocking thing was the idea that you were actually you're from the worst possible place, and is your destiny, is that thing that you feel that you know is part of you somehow, that you're haunted by, is that your destiny? And the idea that choices, that there are things more powerful than blood, as Luke said, that feeling was an important thing to convey for us. This whole trilogy, this 7, 8, 9, is really sort of about the generation that sort of follows the Great Generation, and the idea of balance, bringing balance to the Force, which is the whole point of those the Chosen One, Anakin, the original trilogy. What I loved was the idea that balance brought to the Force doesn't mean it's forever. It's not immediately everlasting. And I think the idea that if we are not careful, that the ultimate evil will rise again, that we have to be proactive in doing what we can to maintain the balance. And how does the generation that follows the Great Generation do that? And the idea that these two main characters, both the grandchildren of these crucially important, characters, the Palpatine and Skywalkers. The idea, as Chris was saying, these two houses coming together in this next generation felt like there was an inevitability to it. And if one were to watch 1 through 9, 50, 100 years from now, hopefully you feel that these stories were inevitably leading there.
It's also an interesting idea about that your legacy doesn't have to define you. We have Kylo Ren, who comes from 2 wonderful parents, 2 good guys, 2 heroes, and Rey, who learns that she comes from the ultimate evil, and yet they're pushing back against that. And I think that's a.
And also, we had a post-it in our room that just it sounded a bit like a fortune cookie, but you don't discover who you are, you create it. And if Act 2 of the middle act, Ryan was discovering who you are, we felt that we needed to really take on the idea of Rey recreating who she is. And of course, to find out she's a Palpatine is a present tense dramatic problem. I mean, you could find out you come from nothing, and that's not just for those of us in this room, all of us who are in this industry, you have to find present tense dramatic problems. And so if I come from a family of Teamsters, I mean, I come from a great, illustrious royal family, that's not for me a present tense problem on this stage. If I found out that I come from a family of the great enemies of J.J. Abrams, and he has hired me and is my boss.
And you know who you are.
And that's my deep, dark secret. That's a present tense dramatic problem that I go to work every day, and it's more interesting for Daisy to play, and for us it was a more interesting story.
I want to talk about something that involves a lot of you, and that's the performance by Carrie Fisher, who of course is no longer with us, but you managed to bring her back to close out this character, and close out this series in what I thought was a pretty moving way, and an extraordinarily complex way, I'm sure. I wondered if we could talk about the process of bringing her back, how the editing factored into that, how the visual effects factored into that, how the sound design factored into that. I know you had footage of her that you used from The Force Awakens, but what shape was that in, and how did you adjust it for what we saw on the screen tonight?
Well, I'll start, and then you guys should take it and run. Before we started writing, we knew that Leia had to be part of the story. You couldn't tell the end of the Skywalker saga without Leia. We weren't going to recast. We couldn't do a CG character. We looked at the footage we had not used in The Force Awakens, and we realized we had a number of shots that we could actually use. So it was a bit like having, a dozen pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and then having to make pieces around it and paint, create an image, a cohesive image from these separate pieces. And so obviously, I knew Carrie for a little bit, for a long time before we worked together on Force Awakens. Obviously, we all loved her, and we're heartsick that she wasn't there. And yet we knew the character had to be. So we started by looking at what these shots were. We started writing scenes around these shots, completely new contexts, new locations, new situation. And we did a test, but it was really like, will this work? Let's just try this. And the one thing I'll say is that whenever you see Carrie, even, by the way, in the flashback, when you see her face, like even those shots, the Luke and the Leia shots, we completely constructed, composed the shots, those pieces around the original pieces that we had. And I will say one more thing, and then I'll shut up, which is that the real credit also needs to be given to someone who's not here, Daisy Ridley, who is, I think, extraordinary in the movie. But in these scenes with Leia, I was watching her off camera on the set, because we were shooting the other side of the scene, and there she was, acting with Carrie in a way that made me believe it looking at the monitor. And I thought, if we can pull this off, which with these people I knew we could, Daisy was the one who was selling it in a way that really made me hopeful on the set.
What was there for her? Were you playing the audio? Were you?
And we were showing her the piece that we had, which of course had not been changed or affected. We had a double there, so there was so much for her to look at. But it was something that was, completely, almost the way I always look back at from, certainly New Hope, in the scenes with Mark, with Luke, and the droids, and the credit that he should get for selling these droids. I mean, he was extraordinary in those scenes, making us all believe that those droids were, were alive and real. So anyway, there was something amazing even on the set that was moving, that I didn't expect. And part of it was that we were all part of this sort of illusion of keeping Leia alive in the film.
In the flashback scene, were those their real faces too, or were those digital simulations?
Those are completely their faces. And Roger can talk to how we did that, but we took faces from the original dailies from the early films. But yeah,
can you talk about that, Roger?
Yeah. I mean, it was, as JJ said, just a massive jigsaw puzzle of putting all these pieces together. And obviously what we were really aiming toward, or when you watch the movie, you just want to believe that Carrie's there, and it's just completely natural within the scene. And basing it around, obviously, the performances that she'd given us previously was the key. And then, of course, we had to stage the scenes and create those shots. And I would say it was an incredibly difficult thing to do. I mean, it's immensely difficult and required a tremendous amount of planning to the nth degree to make this work. I mean, the absolute detail of it. We often use motion control. You'll notice that she has a different hairstyle, she's wearing different wardrobe. I mean, all of those things. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do.
Is that a double, or is that simulated, or how did you?
I don't know whether we want to give away all the secrets of what we did. I mean, partially, but I think we want to have a moment here where we just sort of enjoy her in the movie, and it required an immense amount of planning, and it obviously just wasn't that. It wasn't an easy thing to do at all, and required a tremendous number of people to pull it off. But I think when you watch the movie, hopefully you're seeing Carrie. And we obviously wanted to respect the integrity of her performance in every one of those pieces.
One little thing that comes to mind as you're saying this, and it's sort of completely not off topic, but it's a weird sort of tangential thing. I'm just reminded of Albert Whitlock, the great matte painter, and he would know where your focus was. And if you look at the work, you see the incredible detail and the little light he would use in his paintings, and the other stuff he knew you would see, but it wasn't what you were focusing on. Despite every frame, I think, being, kind of exactly perfect, and there was no area that was sort of more focused on. But the thing that you did that was so extraordinary in making it look as easy as it does is make sure that we were adhering to Carrie and her performance. But that thing was what everything followed.
Yeah, and it is a classic visual effects. I mean, it's a sleight of hand, and of course, JJ's massive interest in magic. I always thought of that when we were doing these shots, was that, everyone's looking at her face, and that was the thing that we held on to, and then we fixed everything else. And that was the difficult thing. But of course, when you think about it, all the footage that we were using was quite often lit in different ways. We had to be really careful about, and the key to it as well, to me, was that you couldn't just cut to her in a single shot every time. You wanted her to be part of the scene, and you wanted her to integrate into that moment, because if she'd been there, you wouldn't have just been cutting to her every time. You would have been moving the camera, you would have been, doing all these things, and she would have been hugging people, for example, which, all of the things that she does in this movie. And that's what was really complicated. And real credit to Daisy for sticking with it. And it required a tremendous amount of patience. And I think, we had a few moments where, sometimes we were exterior and we're trying to shoot shots in the right light. We have to match the light every time. It was very complicated.
One little teeny thing also I'm thinking is that in that moment where she goes through the saber and when she says nothing's impossible, and then Ray says nothing's impossible. Those kind of handshakes as much as we could, whether it was Leia walking in front of Ray, whether it was her handing her something, whether it was a moment of dialogue, anything we could do to not have it feel like it was sort of a binary thing. That it felt like it was an interaction was important.
Yeah, but I mean, she has a different costume, she has a different hairstyle, she's wearing different jewelry, and that was part of the thing about it too. We didn't want it to look as though we'd taken footage from another movie and used it. We wanted it to look as though it was really part of this one.
Carrie, I remember in an interview, she described that outfit from The Force Awakens as fancy gas station attendant. So you don't want to look like that, right? but a fancy one. Dan, can you talk about the matching the shots and trying to find a way to join that, lighting from 2 movies ago with what you're creating here?
Roger's a huge ally of mine, and I pay a huge amount of attention to what he's telling me, and sometimes it's counter-instinctual and it's completely backwards. But I've seen him do his stuff.
Yeah, the great thing about this group of people, we've worked 5 or 6 movies together. We really, and there's a tremendous advantage, I think, sometimes in having history with somebody, because you really understand. You can use a shorthand, and you can. And Dan and I have a lot of experience together, and so the real trick was just matching that lighting every time. And Dan was very kind enough to have enough confidence in us to say, yeah, I'm going to do that, and and that's not an easy thing to do sometimes.
Was part of making it work, like setting the story in a place that was somewhat similar in terms of environment?
Sometimes, and we had conversations about, there's a shot we want to use it exterior, but it wasn't, and Roger's like, no. And I'd say, yeah, but yes. And then he'd say, and then
No.
Yeah. And then we would go back and forth. But we again, this is a relationship that I think respect each other enough so that if I'm saying this is something that needs to happen in a certain way, and you're saying this is something that we need to do in this way, we find a way to make it work. But all of these things, and there were so many. And by the way, there aren't a ton of scenes that she's in. I wish, of course, that she had been with us. I wish she were here now. This would be so much more entertaining. But it would. So yes, yeah, you agree. But I will say that we did what we could with the footage that we had, and it was a million intricate decisions and discussions and trials and things. And it was like again, you made it look really easy, but it was not.
So after all that work, Maryann, it comes to you. And can you tell me about the challenges of putting this together and making it connect and making sure it all fits seamlessly?
Yeah, sure. Well, I will say the last time I actually was with Carrie was in the last ADR session on 7, and I got there before JJ arrived, and she took me aside and was very upset and said to me, I look terrible in this film, you have to make me look good, you have to promise you will always make me look good. And I said, Carrie, that's my job, to always make you look good, that's what I do. And so I started on this film and JJ told me we were going to use the footage from 7. I felt so obligated to make her look good because she had asked me and it was all I ever heard. And so, and of course, I loved her so much, so what would happen is, it wasn't only in post because Roger would come with Pat to my room and we'd sit there and we'd go through takes, and I had the advantage of having cut those scenes before, so I was quite familiar with her performance, and I'd read the script and we'd kind of...
And I might interject that you think it's going to be difficult, and then it becomes, you really start working on it and you realize just how complicated it is, because you have a shot with somebody that you're trying to integrate into a scene and have all the other actors in the same space and look the right ways and everything else. So, we had to plan this, and what we would do is Maryann and I JJ would give us notes, we'd try and assemble a version of that moment with storyboards and then put it back together and say, JJ, something like this. And this was happening in the heat of the production when we had a million things to do. But I mean, quite frankly,
This was the easiest part of the production.
Well, then you would come, we'd do that, and then I'd pick a take ultimately, and I'd pick 3 or 4 takes, knowing which one was my favorite. Then I'd send them off to a storyboard artist in the same building and be like, can you draw out the rest of what's the other actors are gonna do so I can present this to JJ, and then I'd give it back to Roger and he'd show it to JJ and he'd inevitably pick another take, and then we'd switch to another take, and it went back and forth until we got the perfect take, because that's how we do it.
And one of the things to add is that you may have noticed that Billy Lord, her daughter, was in scenes with her. When we first wrote the script, we didn't have the scenes, we didn't write scenes. I didn't want to presume she would want to be in these scenes, but when she read the script, she said, please, if you would, put me in some stuff with her. So that was an added emotional element to it, which was, again, on the one hand, really beautiful and sweet. On the other hand,
And so brave of Billy. I mean, when Carrie is going off, the person helping her off is her daughter. In the last shot that we see Carrie before her death. And every time I see that scene, I'm just moved by Billy's bravery that she wanted to do this for her mother.
I'm sure if she was here, she would be asking what you could use her in next. But you can keep this career going. Michael, I want to talk to you about the costumes and which ones were some of your favorites. But before that, I wanted to ask specifically about a character who I don't think gets a lot of love in terms of how much his costume is appreciated, and that's Emperor Palpatine, who always had the snuggie thing going on. the big black cloak in the original trilogy. And here, when we see him in his sort of withered state, we were talking outside. I said it looks just like a coat hanging in a closet. You had another description of how he looks, how his costume appears when we first meet him.
Well, when we first meet him, he's attached to this machine, which is giving him mobility. It's giving him life, and I likened it to him being in a hospital gown, a black silk hospital gown, and with beautiful texture. It was very, very dark. You couldn't really see it, but the effect was there. And later on, when he becomes his own, fulfilled self, he's wearing, more beautiful robes that you would, think of as emperor.
Almost seems papal in a way. The red, he has the red that comes out. It's very full body.
Yeah, we were talking about this, and one of the sources in my studio were the Francis Bacon papal paintings. And it's funny because when he kind of dies, when he shrivels up, it almost looks like a Francis Bacon painting. So
The disintegration.
He was also wearing like Gene Simmons boots. Like they were crazy. They were like 8-inch boots. I was like, have you met Ian? You're getting me 8-inch boots, but he loved them. It was fantastic.
he took them home.
He did.
That was because I think he's not a very, very tall person, and the robes were long to the floor, but he was a bit diminutive, and I wanted him to have, to be statuesque, to have that kind of presence.
What were some of the other elements of character that you feel the costumes reveal in this movie?
There was a bit of a change with Poe's character. I felt that in this movie, I wanted him to be more of a swashbuckler, kind of more romantic. He meets an old love, and Oscar's a charming, beautiful guy, and I kind of wanted to enhance that with the clothes. And so there was a movie that I always thought about when I thought about him. It was a musical with Judy Garland, And I kind of thought about Gene Kelly in that film, and there was a similarity in his body language to Gene Kelly, and so there came a swashbuckler. It's called a pirate, and we ended up making leather pants for Poe, and knee boots, and he had a neck scarf, and I noticed he had a swagger. I mean, he started moving differently in his costume. He really, really liked it.
And the Aki people for the ancestral celebration, how many extras were you dressing there?
We actually dressed 700. We made 700 costumes, and each costume had multi-layers, and they each had their own jewelry. No two were exactly alike. Neil Scanlon did these amazing prosthetics, hands. We lengthened the arms. We just wanted to do everything we could to take away any kind of, I mean, there were humans inside, and so we wanted to distort that and take away any likeness. And so the costumes were fit in such a way to kind of change their countenance and their silhouette, take away their necks. And so I mean, it was a huge undertaking. I think that was the most difficult costuming in the film, just because of the sheer numbers, and also the fact that we were going to be dressing them in the heat of the Jordanian desert. And everything was hand dyed, everything was handmade. It was something we started very early on in the process because we knew how demanding it was going to be and how long it was going to take.
And was there any cultural inspiration for their looks? I know it's supposed to feel alien, but also one of the tricks that Star Wars often pulls is it takes real things from our world and just changes them a little bit, distorts them a little, and gives us a new perspective. Was there any type of like tribal wear or something that gave you inspiration for how they would look?
Well, JJ and I talked early on, and he wanted to be very colorful, which I knew did not mean every color in the world, because that would look very cheap and it really wouldn't kind of belong in the world that George Lucas had informed us of. And so, you know, I came up with this color palette, and we hand-dyed everything in, you know, maybe 5 different colors, and then different shades of each one of these 5 colors. So it was very limited and controlled. The fact that they were all hand-dyed, I think gave it that kind of tribal feeling.
Rick, you have the challenge of finding impossible places in this movie that don't really exist in the real world. What was it like developing these worlds, these headquarters, these temples, and how did you work with the visual effects team to bring them to life?
What do you mean that they don't exist?
I don't know, can you, no, if they do exist, I think
Well,
there's a big tourism boom about
That's
that.
what made the design part of the movie so easy, because Kevin is a co-designer and Rosemary is a set decorator. We just went out in our, X-Wings, and we went to various places that JJ and Chris would suggest, that Dan said that he could photograph, like a cave that's big enough for a blockade runner, or a desert that has a sand trap. Rick is still joking. And like an ancient city. But what was really easy was when we found that place in the ocean. I said to Roger and Patrick, so let's just put the piece of the Death Star here and
Build a real Death Star.
and then we'll just have it
Build part.
and you kind of shoot it however you want to shoot it. I mean, the point is that in Star Wars you get to go to magnificent places that are really beyond anybody's imagination except for these two guys. And then the rest of us have to come in and figure out, in this most joyous of ways, actually, as much work as it is, how to make all of that come to life. And the
visual effects team, and you saw, did you see when it said digital artists, what happened on the screen? It was like a wall that just was just fine. And on a physical level, what Rosemary and Kevin and the whole art team was able to do with physical sets, it was magnificent because there was so much, I guess, just purposefulness to making a variety of worlds that we got to show in this movie, and for me that was a big thrill.
One of the things that Roger, you taught me when we were doing Mission Impossible 3 years ago was, anything that we can shoot, that we can have, is better than nothing. Like anything you can do, and it was sort of this mantra we used as we went along, certainly on other projects, but mostly on Force Awakens, and then even more so on this one. And it's funny when, Michael, you're talking about how Oscar kind of had a swagger when he was, in his wardrobe. It reminded me of Daisy when we were doing Force Awakens and how BB-8 would be there. And we talked about having BB-8 be a completely CG character for a while, and then we decided, well, we'll puppeteer it and we'll CG out the puppeteer. And I remember she'd come to set, literally in between, takes, she's like, hi, she'd like say hello to BB-8. Like her interactions with BB-8 were emotional because he was physically there. And I think that the sets that we built, the costumes that everyone wore, having the actors surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of these Aki characters there, not only did it give Roger, you and your Pat and your whole team, and those thousands of names that you saw, but it gave something to adhere to match, but it also gave the actors what to interact with, and it changed everything about their behavior, and we could actually light things, and when we were cutting things, it wasn't green screen and blue screen all the time, though of course there was tons of that as well. But it was really, it's just something to behold when you see all those names, and each one of those, 3,500 names that you saw, were people that obviously, as you well know, spent countless hours away from their families and friends to make this happen. And I'm so grateful for not just what the visual effects team did, which is mind-blowing, I think the best work I've seen, but also how important it was to actually shoot these amazing sets that we built. And I think it was a dozen times I went to different sets and my jaw hit the floor, and I couldn't believe we were lucky enough to get to shoot on these sections.
Or dazzling one.
Well, I mean, the cave, the Blockade Runner cave, literally it's all the sets. The Kijimi, the Snowy City, was an entire city that was built on the back lot at Pinewood. When we did the lightsaber battle in the wreck, of course those waves weren't there, but all the water that's bursting around them and landing on them was, they were 50-foot tall, water cannons were,
Yeah, I mean, to be honest though, I've asked myself, well, why did we have all those water cannons? Because actually what we did was we got rid of all the water, and then we added all the water back. You might ask yourself, well, why did we do all of that? Well, the thing is that what you're doing is you're creating the tangibility of somebody having a saber fight on a piece of set, and they're surrounded by water. And if we hadn't done that, then Daisy and Adam would just be fighting, and they wouldn't. You would have nothing to work against. So, in fact, the irony is that Dom Tui, the special effects guy, did all the water, and that created the mood of that piece. But then what we did was then we erased all of that water, because a water cannon does not behave like a wave hitting the side of that pier. So we got rid of all of that and then added our water back in that was behaving correctly. So, I mean, that's why, it sounds mad, but the truth is, that's why it really looks...
Well, that's not mad. You get the water to behave correctly?
But, I think part of the job of the visual effects team is always trying to almost make everything we're doing sort of disappear and be invisible, And, when you're seeing, the 1,900, 2,000 shots in a movie or something, the idea is not to think of it like a visual effects movie. You want to believe that you're really in these places. I mean, that's why, Michael did 700 real Akis, we did 50,000 digital Akis, I mean, the way, but it works because we have the 700 real ones, You know?
Well, imagine what if Daisy wasn't getting water sprayed in her face.
Yeah, exactly.
She would have looked completely different. If Adam's hair wasn't sticking to his forehead, you know, you never could have recreated that.
It creates that sense in the audience too.
Exactly.
Everybody knows what it's like to be stuck in the rain or, you know,
Right, or freezing.
and have to.
Yeah,
And then-
this was outside and they were freezing. It was a 7-day shoot and never complained once, but they were literally freezing.
But you can even see it in their skin and it's
And the
it's
performance you're going to get out of that. You know, I always say to somebody, if you want to, you know, and they say, well, let's pretend that you're next to an explosion. Well, I tell you, if you stand next to an explosion, you get a much better reaction.
And also, just another thing is, you know, there's that serpent in the tunnel. There's Maz Kanata on the stage there. That we had, you know, Babu Frick. All these characters were there being performed, but then, you know, Roger took those elements and embellished and enhanced, and it allowed for the best of both worlds. And it was an amazing thing to watch everyone do their part and work together and make the stuff that was.
Obviously, it's a massive collaboration, isn't it?
Do you have anything else you'd like to add to all that?
Well, I was just going to say, just going back to the sets briefly, one of the things that I think that everybody here does is they don't approach a visual effects movie like a visual effects movie. When you're building a set like where the blockade runner is, one thing that probably people don't realize is when you're looking at the back of the blockade runner, that was actually just constructed perspective painted flats at, you know, the back of the ship. And we, you know, said to each other at some point, you know, maybe we'll have to replace those depending on how it looks, you know, when we see it. But when we saw it on film, it's amazing. It looks great. And that's the sort of stuff that it's worth doing that because you may just get something kind of magical out of it. And
The other
that's
thing
really,
I
really
could
cool.
say is that the key is the collaboration. That's what JJ has led all of us into. We really get along, and we all really believe in it. I mean, this is not like a job. We join in on the wavelength that JJ and Chris have set up here, Kathy and the whole universe with Michelle, and so there's no real boundaries that we have when we're trying to discuss something as to how to make something happen. So I feel very proud of that part of what you get to see is the impact of the final.
But it goes both ways because then we're inspired by what we see from the design team. Like for example, we wanted to give the cave, the resistance base, a soul, and we couldn't figure out how you make it not just look like a Bond layer or the Bat Cave or something. And then Kevin and Rick came up with the idea of always seeing the blockade runner in the background. And that ship that you see in the cave is the first ship you ever see in Star Wars. That's Leia's ship that is fleeing from the Star Destroyer in 1977. And so to always have that present in the background felt like it was the spirit of Leia. And in fact, I think JJ masterfully in the shot where Leia dies, what you see in the background is the first ship you ever saw in Star Wars. You see Leia, you see Han's medal that he received at the end of Star Wars, and you see R2 leaning toward Leia in the way that he did in their first scene together when he got the plans to the Death Star. So to me, that was this marriage of design and imagination and concept art and directing and all these things coming together to tell the story in one tableau, which you could never write. It would have to be a collaboration.
You also see it ascend, right? In a way, sort of like her spirit.
Yeah.
The part. So I want to talk about the sound design and the sound mixing, and particularly one moment when the ceiling opens up and the Emperor unleashes his force lightning on the fleet. That's a pretty spectacular moment, and we were talking about it a little bit outside. But you designed it to sound like the speakers were malfunctioning, like they had been blown out.
Right, so that's when the Emperor opens up with this kind of mother of all force lightning attacks to take down the resistance ships. So we had prepped this kind of explosive electrical blast, kind of what I thought was fairly impressive, but JJ thought, like, let's push it. Let's go bigger. Let's make it like melt brains and make it sound like your ears are going deaf or the speakers are going out. Just like go crazy with it. So we prepped this thing that was this kind of what it is an electric toothbrush on a piece of metal, and it's kind of pitched down and then way overmodulated. So it's got this crazy
Humble origins, just like Ray.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. The Emperor's toothbrush. So that's a fun moment.
He's got a great dental plan.
He says doing great. Well, they have very sharp teeth, so to maintain those. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about the design? There's that great sequence where she's facing down the Kylo's TIE fighter in the desert when all the music falls away, and we hear just the scream of that approaching ship.
Well, that was obviously a moment that we could really take advantage of with sound. Because a lot of times there's music, dialogue, there's a lot going on, but JJ gave us the opportunity to really take this moment where it's very silent and this face-off between our two main characters and build it into something that's incredibly intense. So, you know, we started off at a point that it was good, like we played it for JJ's, it's good, but it feels like we're just starting. So then, you know, Dave, we would talk about it, go back and forth, add a couple more elements, played it again for JJ. What if we had just one more thing that kind of got louder here, and then how to deal with the point at which she jumps up in the air? How do you deal with that? Do you make it big and loud, or do you make it silent, or somewhere in between? And so I think starting in the desert with Rey, just with wind, her footsteps and wind, hearing Rey's, Kylo's ship from very distant, just almost sounds like wind, and then it builds into this crescendo of the Kylo ship coming full speed, and then into almost silence, and her doing the flip, which is an incredible feat. The visuals of that are incredible. And then taking what we did is we took a piece of the sound of Kylo's ship and reverbed it out incredibly, and then kind of lowered that, and the whole thing is just, it feels so visceral and exciting at that moment in the film, and then we get to see Kylo's ship get destroyed as well, which they go through a couple ships, Kylo does.
For those who don't know, do you want to tell them what the TIE fighter sound is?
So yeah, so the TIE fighter sound, the old Benberg recipe is that it's an elephant scream and a race car on wet pavement. So for a lot of the TIE fighters in the movie, not a lot, so for some of the TIE fighters in the movie, we made our own TIEs. And for that scene in particular, it's mostly new TIE sounds. It's new TIE screams. It's the new engine sounds. We wanted it to be something totally new and totally crazy, something you've never heard before. So that's kind of where we went. And as much as we were adding things on Kylo's side of it to make it bigger, we were subtracting elements on Rey's side for contrast. So that's kind of an important side to that too. Is that whole contrast, minimalist on her side.
And one of the things that the person obviously we can't say enough about is John Williams, who is obviously just priceless and such a master and
You can applaud for John.
John Williams. Oh, sorry. John Williams. And John, like, he'll write, he'll score a whole scene, and he'll say, I'm thinking that maybe, he'll say, oh, baby, I'll just write something. And then he writes this thing, you can't believe how amazing it is, and that anyone would give their right arm to be able to do. And he just does it. And so for that sequence, there was music for the whole thing. And pulling out any piece of John's music is always, you feel like you're playing with fire. It's like, why would I ever? And yet, to your point, to try and find a way to make the music, when it's there, have the greatest impact and where to pull back. So it was an interesting, that scene especially, was an interesting exploration. So, when that one moment you just mentioned where the TIE fighter goes right past camera, then it cuts that wide, and you see this little dot going around the mountain in the distance. It's like, I think in that moment, the fact that there isn't music right there just lets it really feel you get the distance in a way, and I just think you guys did an extraordinary job with it. Thanks.
So I think that in the conversation around this film as it opens, and some of the criticism and some of the discourse between the fans, there's a sense of conflict between this movie and The Last Jedi. And how would you react to that? What do you say to people who are
Thanks, everyone. That was good. I will say it would be a much more interesting answer if there were conflict. The truth is that I was, as I mentioned earlier, getting 7 up and running, nothing but grateful that director and writer I admire as much as Ryan was coming in to do that. Not expecting to come back to this. It was just fun to watch what was happening and get to respond to it. When I was called to come onto this movie, though of course I wish we had that time that we didn't. And was working with Chris. We had conversations with Ryan at the beginning. It's been nothing but collaborative, and in a way, the perspective that at least personally I got stepping away from it and seeing what Ryan did, strangely gave us opportunities that would never have been there, because of course he made choices that no one else would have made, just as we all do, and what any of us in this room do. So in a way, it felt kind of like a gift, and though of course there were challenges in every direction, some logistical, some narrative, some everything. It was it was actually weirdly more helpful than not having that other energy. There was I thought there was kind of an alchemy because of the things that he did. And one other thing I'll say is I think that people who say, that this film is kind of like flipping off The Last Jedi, like when Luke says the thing he does about the lightsaber. If the scene in The Last Jedi where Luke tosses the saber over his shoulder were immediately followed by Luke saying, a Jedi's weapon deserves more respect, I think it was insane. But one of the many brilliant things that Ryan did in Last Jedi is give Luke an arc. He learned something. He got somewhere. So at the end of that film, he recommitted to the thing that at the very beginning of the film he was rejecting. And so the idea that even Luke Skywalker can learn something. I think for a kid to hear Luke Skywalker say, "I was wrong," I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think it's something we could all probably do with a little bit.
Well said. Going into the movie, you were anticipating that it's very difficult to please all of the people on the planet, because this is such a vast audience for this. How do you deal with people, or how does it make you feel, or what would you say to people who don't like what happens, or wish it was something different? Is there a problem with the fandom that?
No, I'd say that they're right. The people who love it more than anything are also right. We knew going in. I was asked just, I think 7 hours ago in other countries, someone said, so how do you go about pleasing everyone? And I was like, what? Like not to say that should be what anyone tries to do anyway, but how would one even go about it? Especially with Star Wars. I don't need to tell anyone here, we live in a moment where everything immediately seems to default to outrage. And there's a kind of an MO of it's either exactly as I see it, or you're my enemy. And it's a bit like magicians. You'd think magicians would all just get along. Magicians hate each other. Now, I'm sure there are exceptions, and I'm sure someone will write to me like, "That's not fair, and I hate you." And they'll be right.
Unshaded magicians. I can't believe.
No, but it's like it's a crazy thing that there is such a sort of a norm that seems to be devoid of nuance and compassion. This is not about Star Wars. It's about everything. Compassion and acceptance and allowing people to. It's a crazy moment. So we knew starting this, any decision we made, a design decision, a musical decision, a narrative decision, would please someone and infuriate someone else. And they're all right. And Chris wants to say something.
Well, no, and then your only compass, really, your only North Star is your heart and how you feel about this. I mean, we went into this movie knowing it was a love letter to Star Wars. It was a love letter to the old school kind of filmmaking that inspired George, Republic serials, Flash Gordon, samurai movies, all these other genre references that we love, and it's the stuff about Hollywood movie making that we love. It's the big mythic stuff that we love. And so we went into it sort of deciding that is what we wanted the final episode to be. If you're making the series finale of The Sopranos or The Wire, you want it to feel like The Wire. There are places where you can move the film language forward. I think we did that. I think JJ always wants to do that. But we also wanted you to have 2 last hours with these people that you love, and to really have it feel like Star Wars thoroughly. So those were real decisions that we made, in spite of knowing some people who want us to be innovating more, some people who want us to be innovating less. But we knew, one thing we knew, this last thing I'll say, is we were going to put Leia in the Jedi pantheon in this movie. And that we knew that there was a promise that was made in 1983, that there is another, and that it's Leia. And I had remembered that from my childhood, and I always wished that I could see Leia as a Jedi. And so when we came into this movie, we didn't have Carrie. And the problem of this movie was, how do we finish Leia's arc without actually having Leia? And that's when we came up with the story that someone would come along who would pick up Leia's saber and would finish her Jedi journey for her. And so every day, whenever all the bells and whistles were happening, cast of thousands, Jordan, the set, we would say, how do we tell the story of the two twins, the promise of the two twins being fulfilled, which are Luke and Leia?
I think the last thing, we're going to wrap up now, but the last thing I want to ask you is, we have a surprise in this movie, and it's the appearance of Harrison Ford after many years of saying he was never coming back to Star Wars. You got him back for The Force Awakens. How did you get him back for this, and how did you approach him? What was the pitch?
I called him and I said, we want to have a scene in the film between Kylo Ren and his father. Would you do it? And he said, oh, okay. It's not more interesting. We had a meeting and we talked about what it would be. Harrison, who is one of the great people ever, and incredibly, thoughtful about everything that he does, was all he ever wants is to understand the utility of the character. What is my, so it was about sitting with him and explaining what it was that we, what our intention was, and we talked about it for quite a while. I sent him the pages. He got it, and he really, and then of course, as you can see, he was wonderful. So to have him be in that scene, to have Kylo, to get to dramatize the thing that he had been playing in some form and afraid of, and not open to, the thing that was haunting him, that he was sort of suppressing and rejecting, which was kind of really dealing with what he had done in a way, which was one of the reasons why I think in 8, again, embracing completely what Ryan had written, the idea of kill the past. Why do you think he wants to kill the past? It's like this thing that is haunting him. So the idea that he wants to reject that thing, and it's not until he's shown compassion by Rey that that he's allowed or allows himself to have that conversation, which of course is a thing that he's doing in his mind, but it's the thing that will crush him. And the idea that he knows the spirit of his father would give him permission and encouragement to go to the light side.
You talked about in the first movie about the emotion of seeing Harrison, back as the character. What was it like seeing him for the last time?
Well, it was incredibly surreal because he and I both. First of all, this is what was strange. When we were doing Force Awakens, I still can't imagine what it would be like to come back. At that point, 40 years later, and wear a costume and play a character again. I just think it's insane for all of them, not just for Harrison. And it was weird to be on a Star Wars set and to share with Harrison the feeling of, I never thought I'd be back here doing this. Of course, what his experience was far greater than mine in every way. But it was beautiful having him there with Adam. The two of them always had a great sort of spark, and they somehow gave each other permission, not literally before the scene, but just their nature, to be open and be so vulnerable, and to see two characters that are these traditionally pretty tough guys be so vulnerable, to me speaks to the beauty of what Star Wars has always been, is it shows people, on this screen, in a way that touches people all around the world, that you can be, a princess, and we take it for granted, maybe some of us, but like, no one had ever seen a princess like Leia. Princesses don't behave that way. To have a woman be that forthright, that tough, that decisive, the smartest one in the room always, to see men be vulnerable with each other. Star Wars was always the story of the underdog, and this inclusive sort of world where anyone, organic or synthetic, male, female, doesn't matter what your race or species, everyone sort of, it's an equal opportunity place. So I just love having these two men not behaving in a way that you necessarily expect to see either of them. And of course, having Han get to sort of pay off that I know with his son was incredibly touching.
I thought it was very touching too, very touching. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sticking around.
Thank you.